Tuesday morning, August the 22nd, 1911. A painter named Louis Béraud walks into the Salon Carré of the Louvre, sets down his easel, and looks up at the wall between Correggio and Titian. He has come to paint the Mona Lisa. But the Mona Lisa is not there. 4 iron pegs jut from the wall, nothing else. Béraud does what almost everyone in the museum does that morning, he assumes nothing is wrong. Paintings are removed all the time, he is told. Perhaps the photographers have her. It takes hours of shrugging before a guard is finally sent to the photography studio, and comes back pale. The photographers do not have her. Nobody has her. The most audacious art theft of the 20th century had happened more than a day earlier, and the Louvre, the largest museum in the world, had not even noticed. To understand how a 500-year-old masterpiece could vanish unnoticed, you have to understand what the Louvre was in 1911. It was vast, underfunded, and guarded with a confidence that bordered on negligence. Roughly 400 rooms were watched by a skeleton crew of guards, many of them elderly veterans. There were no alarms. Many paintings simply hung on hooks. On Mondays, the museum closed to the public, and the building filled instead with workmen, cleaners, glaziers, plumbers moving freely through the galleries in white smocks. A white smock, in effect, was a passport to anywhere in the building. The irony is that the Mona Lisa had recently been given extra protection, a glass-fronted case, built after vandals had attacked other works. The museum had hired outside contractors to build those cases. One of the men who had helped fit the glass over the Mona Lisa's face was a slight, quiet Italian handyman. His name was Vincenzo Peruggia. Monday, August the 21st, closing day. The account established at trial goes like this. Early that morning, Peruggia entered the museum in his white workman's smock, indistinguishable from the other laborers. He made his way to the Salon Carré and waited for the room to empty. Then he lifted the painting case, frame, and all off its 4 iron pegs and carried it into a service stairwell. The Mona Lisa is painted not on canvas but on a panel of poplar wood, small enough to carry, about the size of a large tea tray. In the stairwell, Peruggia stripped away the protective case and the frame he himself had helped build. He wrapped the bare panel in a cloth. Then he simply walked out of the Louvre and into the Paris morning, with Leonardo da Vinci's masterpiece under his arm. The whole operation had taken well under an hour. When the truth finally landed on Tuesday afternoon, France convulsed. The Louvre closed for a full week. 60 inspectors and more than 100 gendarmes swept the building room by room, attic to cellar, convinced the painting must still be inside. The borders were watched, ships and trains surged. The frame and the glass case turned up quickly, abandoned in that stairwell, proof the thief had known exactly what he wanted and exactly how to travel light. The newspapers went into a frenzy the like of which no artwork had ever caused. Le Matin, Le Figaro, the international wire services the theft ran on front pages from Paris to New York. Rewards stacked up, the Louvre's friends offered 25,000 francs, a magazine doubled it. The Mona Lisa's face was reprinted in millions of copies so the public could help find her. She was becoming, in her absence, exactly what she had never quite been in her presence, the most famous painting in the world. With no real leads, the investigation reached for the sensational. In September, police arrested the poet Guillaume Apollinaire, one of the most famous literary figures in Paris. His former secretary had once stolen small Iberian statuettes from the Louvre, and suspicion spread by association. Apollinaire spent days in the Santé prison. Under questioning, he named a friend who had bought two of those statuettes years earlier, a young Spanish painter named Pablo Picasso. Picasso was summoned before a magistrate, terrified, by some accounts weeping, and denied everything. Both men were eventually released, neither had anything to do with the missing Mona Lisa. The episode says everything about the state of the case. The French police, humiliated and pressured, were interrogating poets and painters while the actual thief read about the manhunt in the newspapers over breakfast. Then something strange happened. When the Louvre reopened, Parisians queued for hours not to see a painting, but to see where one used to be. They filed past the empty wall in silence, some leaving flowers, as if at a grave. Franz Kafka, visiting Paris that autumn, went to look at the gap. Postcards of the empty pegs sold alongside postcards of the painting itself. Before the theft, the Mona Lisa was a respected Renaissance portrait, admired by critics and connoisseurs, but crowds did not cross the city for her. The Louvre's biggest draws were elsewhere. It was the vanishing that changed everything. Every week she stayed missing. The newspapers asked again, "Where is she?" 2 years of that question turned a painting into a legend. It is one of history's strangest marketing campaigns, run unintentionally, by a thief. So who was Vincenzo Peruggia? He was born in 1881 in Dumenza, a village in Lombardy near the Swiss border, and came to Paris as a young man to work as a painter, decorator and glazier. The records describe a small, quiet, unremarkable man who kept to himself and endured the casual abuse Italian immigrants often met in Paris. Co-workers mocked his accent and called him names. He had 2 minor scrapes with the law, including one over a dispute involving a knife, which meant the police actually had his file, and even his fingerprints. Through the contracting firm Gobier, he had worked inside the Louvre itself, building the very glass cases that protected the masterpieces. He knew the museum's rhythms, when the guards rotated, when the rooms stood empty, and that on Mondays a man in a white smock was invisible. The Louvre had, in the most literal sense, taught its own thief everything he needed. For 28 months, the most wanted object on earth sat in a cheap lodging on the Rue de l'Hôpital St. Louis, barely 2 miles from the Louvre. Peruggia kept the panel in a plain wooden trunk with a false bottom, under his tools and old clothes. And here the story turns almost comic. The police, methodically interviewing every past and present Louvre employee, knocked on his door twice. Both times, detectives sat in a room with the Mona Lisa hidden an arm's length away, asked their questions, accepted his alibi that he had been working elsewhere on the day of the theft, and left. His name appeared on lists, his fingerprints were on file. The print experts of the Paris police never matched the thumbprint left on the abandoned frame. The greatest art hunt of the age failed not for lack of effort, but because no one could believe the answer was this small, this ordinary, this close. In the autumn of 1913, a Florence antiques dealer named Alfredo Geri placed a routine advertisement seeking artworks. Among the replies was a letter from Paris, signed simply Leonardo. The writer claimed to possess the stolen Mona Lisa, and offered to bring her home to Italy for 500,000 lire. Jerry assumed a crank, but answered anyway. In December, Peruggia took the trunk by train to Florence and checked into a modest hotel. There, in his room, before Jerry and Giovanni Poggi, director of the Uffizi Gallery, he lifted the false bottom and produced the panel. Poggi examined the croquelure, the seals, the catalogue markings from the Louvre's own records. There was no doubt. It was her. The two men persuaded Peruggia to leave the painting for examination and wait at his hotel. He went back to his room and waited, and that is where the police found him. He surrendered without resistance. At his trial in Florence in June 1914, Peruggia offered the defense that made him briefly a folk hero. He had stolen the Mona Lisa, he said, for Italy to bring home a treasure plundered by Napoleon. It was patriotism, not larceny. The claim was sincere, and it was also historically wrong. Napoleon never stole the Mona Lisa. Leonardo da Vinci himself carried the painting to France around 1516, and it entered the French royal collection through King Francis I by purchase, not plunder. Prosecutors also noted the 500,000 lire asking price, which sat awkwardly beside pure patriotism. The Italian court was lenient anyway. Peruggia was sentenced to 1 year and 15 days, on appeal it fell to 7 months and 9 days, which he had already served awaiting trial. He walked out of court a free man, to cheering crowds. Italian public opinion had all but forgiven him. The case was closed, fully and finally, in 1914. The painting, meanwhile, made a triumphant homecoming tour in the wrong country. Italy exhibited her in Florence, Rome, and Milan to enormous crowds before honoring its promise to send her back. In January 1914, the Mona Lisa returned to Paris in a special railway car, and more than 100,000 people came to see her in the first 2 days back at the Louvre. Peruggia's later life was quiet. He served in the Italian army during the First World War, married, and eventually returned to France, where he ran a paint shop, apparently untroubled by his past. He died in 1925, at just 44. The painting he stole outlived him into a fame he could never have imagined, and has never left the walls of the Louvre's most guarded rooms since, behind glass his successors made bulletproof. Here is the uncomfortable truth at the center of this story. The Mona Lisa's global fame, the bulletproof glass, the 10 million visitors a year, the crowds holding phones above their heads, does not trace back to art critics or kings. It traces back to a glazier with a white smock and a grievance built on a historical mistake. Before August 1911, she was one masterpiece among thousands. The 28 months of headlines, the empty wall that mourners visited like a shrine, the trial that read like an opera, that is what fixed her face in the world's imagination. Vincenzo Peruggia was caught, convicted, and forgotten. His crime became the most successful publicity accident in the history of art. The next time you see that famous smile behind the glass he once fitted with his own hands, remember, you are not just looking at why she is admired. You are looking at why she is famous.